everyone. Happy 250th. When you're seeing this, it should be the 4th of July, 2026. And today we are with Dr. John Fea. Dr. John Fea, currently the Senior Fellow at the Lumen Center for the Study of Christianity and Culture in Madison, Wisconsin. So a bit of a ways away from New Jersey. But he also taught for 23 years. He taught American history at Messiah University, and also he is the author of The Way of Improvement Leads Home. So, Dr. John Fea, if you would like to take you away for our 250th
Sure.
event at Potter's Tavern.
Yeah. Well, again, happy 4th of July to everyone. Happy 250th. I really became a historian of the American Revolution in Cumberland County, New Jersey. I was living on Long Island at the time, pursuing a PhD, and I learned about uh, Philip Vickers Fithian, one of your more celebrated residents of Greenwich, met up with a legendary figure in the study of history in the Cumberland County region, Jonathan Jack Wood. And from there, he got me very excited, introduced me to the region and so forth. And I wrote my first book about one of your favorite sons, Philip Vickers Fithian, who was, again, born in Greenwich. He was a Presbyterian minister. He was a patriot, Revolutionary War chaplain. So brings back a lot of memories here on the 250th. And as I'm nearing the end of my career, thinking back to that first book on Cumberland County history. So it's a fitting opportunity to be able to speak to all of you today. I'm not going to speak for long, but what I just wanted to note was, I wanted to talk a little bit about the role that Cumberland County played in the American Revolution, say a few words, and perhaps exhort you a little bit to think about the role of history and the importance of the American Revolution, not only in the 18th century, but as well in our current lives today, our current democracy and so forth. Since I think historically, 4th of July speeches, they used to be called 4th of July orations, would always connect with the past, but also speak about the present. So in that tradition, I want to say a few words regarding the past and the present. There was a historian at the turn of the 20th century. His name was Carl Becker. And he wrote a book on it's actually a pretty boring book, very scholarly book on the history of politics during the American Revolution in New York. But he had this one line that kind of has stuck, and it's stuck with a lot of historians of the American Revolution. He said the American Revolution was really about two things. One he called home rule, and then the second issue was who would rule at home. So I want to frame my comments to you today around those two ideas, home rule and who would rule at home. The first question is really a settled question. Home rule. Who got to rule, who got home rule during the American Revolution? Well, as we of course know, the Continental Army defeated the British Army in the Revolutionary War. And the Declaration of Independence, of course, was issued in July of 1776. And America, the British American colonies, declared their independence from Great Britain. They said, home rule now belongs to us, not to Great Britain, not to the king, not to Parliament. Home rule is something that I think we are going to celebrate a lot this year and this month and even today, right? We want to remember the events of the past. We want to remember what happened, right? So this is celebrating home rule is the three-corner hats and the 1776 flags and all of the things that happened in the 18th century that led to the American Revolution. Again, we celebrate home rule, but home rule really is over. It's been established. Again, it was established in 1776, or you could say it was secured with the Treaty of Paris in 1783 at the end of the war. Becker, though, had this other line where he said, again, the American Revolution is about home rule, the history, the events leading up to the revolution. But then there was this question about who shall rule at home. Now, this is the question of once we've declared independence, who should be leading our new nation? Who should have power? Whose voices count? Right? Who shall be the ones shaping this nation? Who shall now rule at home now that we have home rule? And, in the 1780s and 90s, these were debated questions in the United States. There was great division over the questions of who shall rule at home. You had Jeffersonians and Federalists. You had in the 19th century Whigs and Democrats, right, all the way up to the 20th century. My point is, the question of who shall rule at home is not a decided question. It's not over. But rather, the American Revolution, as the founders perceived it, is all about how we are now going to take these ideals and these values, liberty, freedom, equality, rights, all of these things, civic responsibility, and how these things are now going to be applied as we move forward. So today, on July 4th, 2026, the question, who shall rule at home, is still very much alive. And it's a day where we not only celebrate the past, home, how America got home rule, but also how we should rule at home. Now, what fascinated me the most about Cumberland County and New Jersey, southern New Jersey, but most of my time was spent in Cumberland County, was the way in which this local community intersected at almost every point with the more colonial-wide revolutionary movement that was taking place. As a scholar, I'm not a local historian, right? I can't just tell a story about a particular place without connecting it to sort of much larger trends that are going on. Trends not only among the 13 colonies, but also trends in the larger sort of English-speaking world, the transatlantic world, as we call it. So let's take these two ideas, home rule and who shall rule at home, and think about them in the context of Cumberland County, and even more specifically, the Cohansey River region, as I describe it in my book, The Way of Improvement Leads Home, this biography I wrote of Philip Vickers Fithian. And I would say, in terms of home rule, what should we remember about the 18th century on a day like this? Well, there's a lot we should remember, but I would suggest that we remember three things about the local history. And really, a lot of this local history then also will explain what happened in other regions, not only in New Jersey, but around the British colonies. I think the one lesson that we learned from Cumberland County is the American Revolution required a certain degree of local resistance. You could talk all you want about the Continental Congress. You could talk all you want about the gathering of the 13 colonies together. But the real nuts and bolts happened on the ground in specific particular places. And of course, the penultimate example of this in Cumberland County was in December of 1774, the Greenwich tea burning. Of course, all of you know there's a monument to that. There's a bunch of names on that monument that are really interesting. I've actually studied those names, and it's sometimes it's difficult to figure out who was involved and who wasn't. But nevertheless, there is a monument to this event. Where a bunch of young men from Cumberland County, when a shipment of tea came in through the Cohansey River, they burned this tea, and it was in some ways a copycat act of what had happened the previous year in Boston in 1773. But the point I want to make here, and again, I've written about the Greenwich Tea Party in multiple places, or tea burning. The point I want to make here is that the revolution happened in local places on the ground, and it was associated with local resistance. That's number one. Number two, I think the revolution was cultivated in community. And here I don't just mean the geographical location of the settlements along the Cohansey River, but here I mean through deliberate efforts to come together as individuals and talk about and debate political ideas, to read things together, to discuss things together, right? To be engaged citizens, although technically there's no such thing as citizenship until 1776, but to be engaged revolutionaries. I can think of several examples here. I'll mention two. One was this group known as the Bridgeton Admonishing Society. This was a group of young men. As far as we could tell, there weren't any women involved, but there could have been. Again, read the book. But this was a group that came together. They read things together. They sat around and talked about how to improve their lives, right? How could reading a novel, or how could discussing Cato's letters, or how could discussing various different popular writings on the revolution, how could this shape us to be better citizens? And this was the entire purpose. This was an ad hoc group. It was not a formal group. They met at different locations. But the Bridgeton Admonishing Society was the kind of incubator for a lot of the local political resistance that I was just talking about earlier. It didn't just happen overnight. There were these groups of people who were actually cultivating citizenship in this society. And then the second one I'll mention in terms of community, political community, intellectual community happening in this rural region was the newspaper, the Plain Dealer. The Plain Dealer was not a widely circulated newspaper, but it was written by local residents, and it was placed in Potter's Tavern, where you are right now. Right? It was placed in Potter's Tavern, and not only people came and picked up a copy, they read the essay every week, and they sat around with their favorite drink, hard cider, or whatever it happened to be, and discussed the ideas. And many of these Plain Dealer articles dealt with the larger revolutionary experience happening throughout the colonies. So public spaces like taverns, for example, served as a place in which the American Revolution was debated, discussed, and it brought about a kind of intellectual engagement with the larger world, even from this tiny little rural community located so far away from Philadelphia. So I coined this term in my book, the rural Enlightenment, because it was in places like rural Cohansey, not just in the cities, in the salons and coffee houses of Philadelphia, or even to take it further, London, that these ideas were cultivated, but they could be cultivated even in a place like the Cohansey River region. So secondly, first local resistance, second local community. And then I think here's something that, was maybe not universal in every community in British North America, or along the eastern seaboard, at least in the 13 British colonies. But in Cohansey, there is a particularly dense, I call it a thick culture of Presbyterianism, Calvinism, and many of these events, the Boston, all the things going on in Boston with the Tea Party and the Boston Massacre, and all these other major events that we often learn about in civics class or in history class growing up. Remember that matching quiz? You had like the Townsend duties on one side, and you had to match it with what it was about, and those kinds. All of this popular narrative we think about when we think about the Revolution was often understood in Cohansey, which I argue in my book was one of the most concentrated per population, one of the most concentrated Presbyterian enclaves in the British American colonies. You had Bridgeton Presbyterian Church, Deerfield Presbyterian Church, Greenwich Presbyterian Church, and Fairfield on the south side of the Cohansey, all within miles of one another. And they all knew each other. The patriots in Cohansey processed these revolutionary events through the church, through their Calvinism, through their theology, And as a result, there was this fusion, I think, between all of these Enlightenment political ideas like liberty, equality, freedom, right, rights, and and Christian faith in that sense. It wasn't as if the people were trying to create the people of Cohansey were trying to create some kind of Christian country or Christian nation, but rather they were interpreting the events partially, at least, through their Christian faith. It's impossible to ignore that, whatever your particular views are about the role of religion and the American founding, which is also a very heated debate, which I've spent some time thinking about and writing about. So home rule. I think these are the ways in which Cumberland County participated in the the British colonies getting home rule from England. Now, the question of who shall rule at home is, of course, sort of an ongoing question that we continue to debate, as I already mentioned. And I'm not an expert on this, but I know enough about Cumberland County history to then suggest, what has who shall rule at home kind of look like? What do the ideals of the American Revolution, liberty, equality, freedom, these kinds of things look like? For example, when newcomers come to the region, or when there's diversification within the region? What happens when all those Italians start coming into Vineland and Hamilton in the late 19th and early 20th century? The Jewish agricultural communities that form in the region. During World War II, right? Seabrook Farms and all these Japanese laborers come into the country. In the 19th century, the oyster workers on the Morris River, say. Um, you know, this is the ongoing story of Cumberland County and the nation as a whole. And the question then of who shall rule at home is how are these people, how are these newcomers, right, going to be, and as more and more newcomers come today, right, how are the principles and ideals that Cumberland County fought for and participated in the 18th century going to be then consistently applied to a much more culturally diverse and pluralistic South Jersey, Cumberland County countryside. So I think both home rule, who should rule at home are important. Historians should not think about the revolution just as an event frozen in time, right? That somehow we just need to unthaw it in 2026. And, that's not what historians do. That's what antiquarians do, right? They just study the past for its own sake, with little relationship to the present. But rather, historians are always thinking about change over time and how the revolution and these ideals are applied to the various ways in which societies and cultures change, and in this case, change over the last 250 years. So I think that's how I would approach a sort of traditional Fourth of July oration as I think about the history of your wonderful community there in Cumberland County, and particularly that sort of hotbed of revolution there along the Cohansey River. So thanks for giving me the time to say a few words.
Thank you so much for speaking.
Yeah,
I mean, my goodness, I really appreciate the two different ways of looking at it. I feel like I don't even have a question really. One of the things I wanted to comment on when you were talking about local community and people
yeah,
coming together, you mentioned the plain dealer, and it's less of a question, but one of I remember reading bits of the plain dealer, and one of my favorite parts was somebody submitted an essay saying that they didn't like something that women did.
yeah, yeah.
And he's like, it's not ladylike. And
Right, right.
the next following few entries are just people
Yeah,
saying, what? Like going
yeah,
right back at him. And it's, of course, the ideals of womanhood, respectability, that all ties into politics and these civic conversations, but it's not as overt as freedom, liberty. It's
yeah, yeah,
more,
yeah.
it reminds you that people have always been people, and there's a humanistic thing throughout
Yeah, yeah,
history that sometimes I think gets lost.
Yeah,
Um, and especially when we think of the American Revolution, I think it's
yeah,
easy to say that was 250 years ago. That
yeah,
has
yeah,
nothing to do with me now,
right.
totally different time, place, and people.
Yeah,
And to kind of just remind yourself of like, no, well, you meet up with your friends and you talk about
yeah,
things, and
yeah.
someone can say something on social media in the next couple days. It's everyone responding to that.
Yes.
It's
Yeah.
just
Well,
different
several
feelings.
things trigger, your question triggers several things. One, I think there's a real danger, and we see this in certain sectors of our culture and the way we think about history today. I think there's a real danger of using the past to justify certain positions in the present. And what I mean by that is to say, well, let's let these people off the hook because that's just the way they did it back then, right? So we shouldn't worry about these issues today. And that's the point that I'm trying to make about change over time, right? I think the cultures change as in America at least, the culture changes. And you see this not only with women, you see it with abolitionism, you see it with all kinds of reform movements where the ideals of the American Revolution, you see it with Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement, right? The ideas of the American Revolution have not always been consistently applied. So I think the story of America 250, again, is not just, wow, this is what happened in the 18th century. Let's try to duplicate it and have reenactors, right? Do the same thing they did, right? But rather, the story is also a story of these ideals and how they have, or maybe have not yet, been consistently applied to whatever the social movement is, and in this case, women's rights and so on. I mean, it didn't. It took what more than 100, almost 150 years before these ideals and values were actually applied to women in the United States. On the other hand, you could argue that without those ideals and values and without people fighting for those ideals and values, you may not have, had such an effective women's movement. They had a body of ideas to be able to say, this is not right, this is not American, right? These kinds of things. The other thing that strikes me about your illustration with the plain dealer is there does seem to be, uh, again, a spirit of debate about these things, right? There's pushback, there's back and forth, there's dialogue. And even if we're not getting to the point where we want to go in terms of applying these ideals to everyone, um, debate is always good and productive if it's done in a kind of civil way because it pushes the conversation forward, right? So I think we can learn something about these kinds of debates that happened over the plain dealer and the arguments and so forth. But yeah, two good example there with women and the plain dealer. Yeah,
Thank you. Thank you. I feel like you tied everything that you wanted to say up together perfectly. So just as a side question, something I
yeah.
want to ask is what was one of your favorite things that you found out, or the most interesting that you found out while researching Philip Vickers Fithian?
Yeah, yeah. Again, this is a side thing because what I'm going to say is not going to be particularly related to what I just spoke about. Um, my students, many, would often do like a bulletin board for the history department, and they'd ask the professors, if you could go back and meet one person in American history, who would it be? And some people say someone famous, like Abraham Lincoln or Susan B. Anthony or something like that. I always say Philip Vickers Fithian. I say that for two reasons. One, because I want people to learn about this guy and read my book. So that's the kind of selfish selfish reason. But remember, I was just working with his diary and some letters, right? So so there's so many empty spaces. There's so many questions I want to say. Having spent years with this guy's diary, there's so many times where I want to say, why did you do that? Or how could you be so stupid? Or what led you to this decision? But in this regard, you can't beat those letters that Fithian wrote to Elizabeth Beatty who he would eventually marry. There really is a kind of love triangle there between this gentleman named Rodman, who I never figured out who he actually was. But what fascinates me the most about the letters are not just that they can be very juicy or very, really interesting, and they shed light on courtship in the 18th century. But I would argue, and I do in the book, that they are Philip's letters to Betsy are definitely linked to his understanding of what it means to be an educated person, a even a patriot to some extent. And here's what I mean by that. There is a battle in Philip Vickers Fithian's mind and soul between reason and the passions. And he knows because he went to Princeton. He studied under John Witherspoon, the only minister who signed the Declaration of Independence. He knows because he's an educated man that the reason must always control, right? This is why they call the Enlightenment the age of reason. Reason must always control the unruly passions. And for Fithian, the passions, good Presbyterian, the passions could also be sin too, right? I'm sinning, right? This is a passion. And he is so in love with Elizabeth, with Betsy, that he has a hard time, even as he's articulating all of these things in his diary about being an educated person and so forth. He can't seem to get his rational faculties to control his sort of deep longings and love for this woman, and it gets him in trouble on multiple occasions. And to me, it's just such a story of the revolutionary generation. Like Philip wants to be a leader of the revolutionary movement. He wants to be an educated elite, so to speak, right? Maybe not a founding father like the main founding fathers, but someone who was part of that movement and generation. Who knows what he would have done if he hadn't passed away of dysentery in Fort Washington during the New York campaign in 1776. But he wants to be that, but he's a young man, so it's a story of coming of age and trying to like control those passions and so forth with Betsy. So that was always my favorite part. When I would talk about the book to scholars, I would talk about these, these intellectual things like the rural enlightenment and this kind of stuff. But when I go to give like a public talk to like just a group of people who are interested, I'd always center the talk around Philip and Betsy. It's one of the great love stories. Not as sensational as John and Abigail Adams, but in the ballpark, right? Philip and Betsy don't have as many letters. And as some of you who know this history know, it was mostly Philip writing to Betsy. So you had to interpret what Betsy was saying from what Philip wrote about in his next letter. So that was fun. It was a great detective work. It was fun to write about, and it's still a story that I like to tell people.
Yeah, you kind of partially answered it for me. I was going to ask, in your research, was there anything similar on Betsy's side, sort of this inner turmoil of dealing with feelings and also navigating this Republican womanhood or womanhood in the revolutionary period? Again, probably harder to see, and I'm sure that in her letters a lot more is, I'm sure she can manage to be more subtle, cover it up in that way, but I don't know. I didn't know if you
Yeah.
were able to see anything
It's
that
hard.
she
It's
was
hard because we
experiencing.
don't we only can speculate. I think there's one letter. I published this book in 2008, so it's been a while, but I think there's just one letter um, that Betsy actually writes that we have, maybe one or two. Uh, and it clearly in that letter, she is so Betsy, is raised in this like very prestigious Presbyterian home. Her father is Charles Beatty, who's one of the foremost Presbyterian ministers. He pastors the Presbyterian Church in Shankman, Pennsylvania. Her brothers were all patriots. I think a couple of her brothers actually served in government positions in the first government, or maybe they ran for office. I'm trying to remember that, but they definitely were office Continental Army. So she has this. She understands the connections between Christianity, education, you know, what an educated, enlightened person should be thinking about and how they should behave. And in the one letter, she really rebukes Philip for not acting in a kind of gentlemanly person, an educated way. This is not how a Princeton man should be, you know, responding and engaging her. So we get a little bit of that, but I think clearly, and this is again, we can't prove this, but the context helps. I mean, she clearly would have understood herself as a patriot within that kind of Republican motherhood kind of ideal. Now, again, they never had any kids, so it's really hard to flesh out. She actually ends up marrying Philip's cousin after Philip dies, and really she kind of falls off the map after that, except for a few letters back and forth to her brothers that we have in her brother's papers. But
Perfect.
she's buried in the Greenwich Presbyterian church burial ground
Oh, she is?
across the street from the church. Yeah, right down. Well, you're in Greenwich. You're in Greenwich now, but yeah,
Yeah.
right down the road from the library there.
Okay, well,
Yep. You can check
is
out
it?
her tombstone or her
Yeah,
gravestone. Yeah.
I was gonna say I'll have to pay her a visit.
Yes.
Well, I think those were all the questions that I had, and I did have to move locations. It got a little bit noisy.
Okay.
But so that's everything for me. So thank you, Dr. Fia,
Okay.
for coming and joining us and
Yeah.
for talking. This has been so interesting.
Yeah.
I very briefly dealt with Philip Vickers Fithian and his
Yeah.
actual letters, but
Yeah.
in the little bit you do work with him, he's a really fascinating guy.
Fascinating figure.
I
Yeah.
think also just again to the point of people feeling human, he just feels like
Yes.
a guy.
Yeah. Yeah. He does. He does. He's an ordinary farmer who gets caught up in the revolution, and I think there's really no figure in the 1770s in Cumberland County, except with the exception of the local ministers, Andrew Hunter, Enoch Green, William Hollingshead. Um, there's really no one else like him, who rides. It's really an American story, this kind of farmer son who goes to Princeton. The other guys, they were from other places, the ministers, and they were appointed
Mhm.
to come, but he's a local boy who makes good, again, he has a tragic ending to his life, but fascinating figure. And I had such a wonderful time studying him and then walking the grounds,
Mhm.
with Jack Wood, learning about the different churches. And I will always remember early in my career the experience I had there with all the good people. I know Joe Matthews, Warren Adams, they sometimes would open up the library for me when it was closed and I could work in there. So again, fond feelings, fond memories for the people of Cumberland County, New Jersey, and I will always have them, even when it's not the 250th anniversary. So thanks for inviting me to you.
Of course, thank you for
Yep,
joining us. Thank you for your
sure.
love for the county.
Yes.
Oh, good afternoon, Tia. I hope that the people you're with when they watch this enjoy it. It's nice to see you again.
Nice to see
Tia
you.
was one of the great students of our graduate program a few years ago, not that long ago. So yeah, it's coming up on the 250th anniversary. For all I know, it's even closer by the time people see this. And so Tia's asked me to talk a little bit about sort of the origins of the American Revolution, and maybe I'll try to also talk a little bit about its overall significance. This is largely off the cuff, so we'll see how this goes. So I guess a couple of things to think about to set a framework for trying to understand how and why the 13 North American British colonies declared independence, when they did and how they did, are to sort of confront a couple of, I think, misunderstandings that people have, right? At least students have, both undergrads and graduates that I teach. And what people tend to do is they tend to come in thinking that the American Revolution was the result of a sort of a long, slow, steady process of people living in North America coming to feel less and less and less British and more and more and more frustrated by the idea that people who they were so unlike and were growing more unlike continued to insist upon governing them to the point where it just became ridiculous, absurd to think that they would remain under their authority. And what I want to suggest is that that's almost precisely the opposite of what happens and why the American Revolution takes place. So one way to do that is to, in other words, the American Revolution is many things, but one thing it's not is the result of a growing and increasingly coherent and felt and meaningful sense of American difference and even American nationalism. But that's not the source of the American Revolution. If anything, it's almost the exact opposite. It's a deep engagement with a sense of British selfhood and even a British imperial sense of subjecthood, and a feeling that that deep engagement with that British selfhood is not being properly respected and is being violated by British imperial policymakers. So in order to defend that position, because that's usually people resist that. I mean, people don't like to hear that, and it's just not what it seems counterintuitive, but doesn't seem like it would make a lot of sense. What I suggest is sort of, we think about a kind of a good working definition of what some sort of, distinct Americanness would be. What would it be? What would you have to be something that was distinctly American? And a good practical working definition of that, a simple definition, would be just something that's not British, something that's very unlike what the British do. Sort of a conscious effort to be something distinct from and different from what the United Kingdom is at whatever time that you're thinking about it. Today, we have no trouble finding all kinds of ways in which we're very different in a lot of our attitudes, in the way we think, the way we dress, the way we talk, the way we eat. And sometimes people even have trouble understanding each other. There's no question that we're two different nations. And what I'd like to suggest is that if you're looking for a kind of a distinct sense of wanting to be different from the English and to be consciously rejecting things that are English, the further back in the colonial past you go, the more likely you are to find that. And if you think about like all of these colonies, almost all these colonies, there's a couple exceptions, but almost all of these colonies were formed in the 17th century, all but one, Georgia, which is formed in the 18th century. All the other 12 colonies were formed in the 17th century. And virtually all of them were formed by people leaving in the early 17th century, leaving England behind, having rejected what at the time was their English mainstream. Right, so the Puritan colonies are all leaving England behind, not necessarily rejecting the Church of England as an institution, but insisting the Church of England is so corrupted and so weakened and so far from what a good Protestant church should be. They literally have to travel 3,000 miles away to what they themselves call a howling wilderness to provide a better example that they hope that England will then follow them into becoming. Right, so they're leaving England to try to redirect the English mainstream in a way that's very distinct from what it is. And they do that in America. So that I think we could call American, right? And the Quakers who found Pennsylvania 30, 40 years after the Puritans come are part of sort of the English, radical vanguard of the English Revolution, the sort of countercultural rejection of monarchy, rejection of hierarchy, rejection of status. They don't doff their caps. They don't take oaths. All sorts. Trying to create a much more egalitarian and equal society, and are finding that increasingly when their ideas, which for a while are being tried, or ideas like those in the middle of the 17th century, are overthrown and the monarchy is restored, that it's not a very hospitable place for them, and try to go somewhere else to try to practice their ideas. And while I won't go into all the details, you could tell a similar story for the founding of Carolina, which is also an experiment by people who are deeply unhappy and dissatisfied with their own English mainstream, right? And if you look at all of these mainland, and even Virginia, which is the closest thing to trying to recreate royal institutions and English institutions, eventually in North America, those institutions really don't function at all effectively in the 17th century, and Virginia almost disintegrates in terrible civil war in the 1670s and 1680s. So in many ways, the further back you go, the more you find people who are consciously and openly trying to reject the English mainstream and come up with something they think is better and show England how it should be different than it is. And what's interesting is that all of those experiments and all of those efforts in really complicated and fascinating ways all kind of fall apart in the final quarter of the 17th century. And there's some spectacular examples of this. I mean, the Puritan experiment, which really is beginning in the 1630s and going through the rest of the 17th century, ends with the murder of grandmothers in Salem, right? I mean, that's sort of the culmination of these efforts to try and build this city on a hill. This Puritan community is the the increasingly paranoid and frightened and terrified fear of elderly women and the spectacular sort of witch craze, which is not typical in Puritan Massachusetts, right? I mean, there's fewer than 100 witchcraft accusations in all of the 17th century Massachusetts, but over half of them are in Salem in a couple of years, right? This is a place that's really kind of falling apart. And in ways that are less spectacular, there's conflicts within Pennsylvania where different factions of Quakers are literally chopping up each other's meeting houses with axes in the 1680s. I mean, this experiment in kind of brotherly love and equality and egalitarianism and harmony falls apart. And the Carolina experiment, which is really a sort of a utopian effort to kind of conceive of an entire society on paper and then put it into practice, written by some famous people like John Locke, falls apart as well, and that society just becomes sort of a killing ground for the enslavement of Indians and the slaughter of the slaughter and ultimately the depopulation of the entire deer population and the kind of the destruction of the original Carolina economy. So none of these experiments work, but they're all very consciously what I would call American. That is, trying to be something distinct and different from the English. And what's interesting is that at the same time, in the last quarter of the 17th century, 1675 to 1700, at the same time that all of these experiments are kind of disintegrating, the actual English mainstream that they were so dissatisfied with also is disintegrating. It disintegrates in increasingly plots against what they fear are oppressive and horrible kings, the efforts to assassinate kings, finally a revolution in 1688-89, and a very conscious effort to build a new and different kind of mainstream. Nothing like any of the American experiments, but something distinct. And so what you have at the end of the 17th century, interestingly enough, is almost near universal collapse of all the various efforts to build English-speaking societies throughout England and North America. These are very different efforts. They're often in conflict with each other, but the one common theme they have is that none of them have worked. And even Virginia, which was an effort to kind of build royal institutions, also falls apart, as I said, in violence and civil war in the 1670s and 1680s. So really what the 18th century, the six decades or so before our people mostly get interested, which is the coming of the American Revolution, that 18th century is a story of putting a lot of new ideas into practice and putting things back together again. And a lot of this has to do with sort of the twin engines that are really driving the English empire and also North American colonial growth in the 18th century, which are shared commitments to Protestantism and war. Is what happens as a result of the disintegration of mainstream institutions in England in the 1680s and culminating with the Glorious Revolution in 1689, is that very brand new ideas about monarchy really begin to reshape England and then Britain. And fundamentally, what the English do is they reject the way monarchy had worked for centuries, and that was still the sort of operating procedures for monarchy in all of the other European nations that would become their competitors, particularly France and Spain. And they reject the sort of classic idea we associate with monarchy, which is the idea of divine right monarchy that rules with absolutist authority. Divine right meaning that the power of the king comes directly from God, and therefore only God is the judge of the king. There's no earthly constraints that can be placed upon a king. In fact, you often hear, as we're talking a lot about the revolution these days, more than we often do, and you'll often hear people saying, like, we rejected monarchy. We didn't want a king any longer, and that's true. But then the next sentence is they usually describe a monarchy that actually didn't exist in the British Empire. So they'll often describe a monarchy that wasn't wasn't under the authority of the rule of law, or that wasn't constrained by earthly institutions. In fact, the English create the first kind of monarchy that is. And what they create coming out of the Glorious Revolution is an idea of what they call limited constitutional monarchy. The idea that the monarch will still have considerable authority and power. The monarch will form governments. The monarch will be able to declare war and establish peace. The monarch will be through proxies in control of the vast army and navy. But there are certain key authorities that they take from monarchy and instead place in their legislature, which they call parliament. And the most important of those is the power and authority over taxation and money, which they place in fact, the House of Commons. The Parliament is made up of two houses, the House of Lords and the House of Commons. The House of Lords, like it sounds, is all of those hereditary lords. If you've watched Downton Abbey, you've run into earls and dukes and all that kind of thing. All those people who have noble title in England through virtue of their birth get to sit in the legislature in the House of Lords. But the second house is the House of Commons, which, as its name would suggest, are people not commoners necessarily, but common folk in that they don't have title. And the House of Commons is meant to represent all of those tax-paying landowners in England who are not of noble birth and therefore need to have representation as well. And what happens with the Glorious Revolution is that the sole authority to tax is placed in that House of Commons, not with the king and not with the House of Lords. And the reason for that is because what the English accuse absolutist monarchs of doing, and the reason why they're rejecting and getting rid of that form of monarchy, is they say that absolutist monarchs never can protect fundamental rights and liberties, most importantly, the right of property. They say is if absolutist monarchs are in fact above law and are the state, Louis XIV is the best example of this, the King of France, who says, l'état c'est moi, right? I am the state, then they have the authority to determine taxation, its rate, its method, its the degree to which it occurs at all. And they could, without the constraint of the people who are paying the taxes, tax away property to the point where people no longer could sustain themselves and therefore would lose their liberty. So what the English are saying is, if we're going to have governments, and if we're going to have those governments do things and need funding and finances to do it, and need the power to tax, we have to place some limits and constraints on those powers, or else the subjects' property will be in danger and their liberties will be threatened. And the way that they have both the power to tax and the way to protect the people's rights and liberties is to establish that only this House of Commons can tax. And what that provides them is a phrase that becomes very important for those coming in the American Revolution, the idea of taxation connected to representation. And the way that works, and this is then after this is established in the 1680s and early 1690s, this becomes a fundamental right that all English property owners believe they have wherever they live. The way this works is that the English say, now, unlike in France, unlike in Spain, unlike any other monarchy that you could name, the only authority that can take away a portion of the subject's property and use it for the needs of the state is a body that, one, is elected by the taxpayers. The House of Commons is elected through elections. Unlike the House of Lords, they don't get to sit by hereditary right, or the king, who inherits because the king or queen is the closest blood relative to previous kings or queens. The House of Commons has to be elected by the taxpayers, and the House of Commons also has to pay the same taxes that it is obligating taxpayers to pay. And what the English say is, if both of those things are true, if the people who are taxing you are chosen by you, and if they have to pay the same taxes they're requiring you to pay, they'll never tax in a way that is dangerous or threatening to you, because you, one, could just remove them if they did, and two, they would be hurting themselves if they were hurting you, because they would have to pay the same taxes. And so there's a way in which, very powerfully, the king's power is limited. Right? The English say it's limited by a fundamental law, a fundamental value, which is what we call constitutional law. And so this limited constitutional monarchy is limited, and the monarch doesn't have the authority to determine how much money he will have, the way he will get it, or how much he'll have to spend. That is determined by his subjects, who then will demand a great deal of say in why the taxing is happening and what the money will be spent on. So this is a way in which the English subject expects to have a great deal of participatory authority over the direction of the English government. And right off the bat, what that leads to is war with France, which is furious. Louis XIV is furious at this model of kingship and doesn't want it to spread and doesn't want there to be any kind of weakening of his own authority as an absolutist and divine right monarch. And these wars, which begin in the late 17th century, just as everything had been collapsing in England. So you'd think, okay, England and the colonies are kind of ripe for the plucking. They've all begun to fall apart. All their experiments have failed. They've all been moving in opposite directions. What those end up doing is becoming a powerful unifier of English-speaking peoples, both inside England and Scotland, and also in North America. Because the wars, for one thing, last a very long time. I mean, they don't happen continuously, but essentially the wars that start in 1689 and are now being fought between two different conceptions of what monarchy should be, with, in many ways, the English feeling that their sense of limited constitutional monarchy and liberties of the subject and their Protestant religion are fighting against the idea of absolutist monarchy and divine right authority and the French Catholic religion. So a great deal is at stake here. That can be felt by every English-speaking person. And if you look at a map of North America, you're familiar, right? The French aren't just across the ocean. They're just from Boston, a couple of days march away in Canada. And the French with the native allies are participating in these wars. So France is present in North America just as England is. And so you can feel, no matter what kind of English person you are, that there are fundamental rights that are being protected by this new form of monarchy, and also your religious beliefs that would be in danger if you lost these wars. So these wars can be very unifying. And these wars that start in 1689 with France and England going to war don't really stop until the final defeat of Napoleon in 1815. And for much of our period, before the Revolution, 1689 to 1763, the English and the French are either at war or preparing to be at war, which is really costly and really expensive, but also makes it very clear to people what's at stake. And so what you see is, right off the bat with this new form of monarchy, for one thing, England begins to be a lot better at raising the kind of money you'd need to fight wars that are of such importance and at such high stakes. Because now, with this new way of taxing, the act of taxation becomes a much more legitimating action to taxpayers because they have so much authority and control over it. And they can also see the reasons for it, the purposes for this taxation. It couldn't be for, from their perspective, better or more valuable purposes, right? They want to protect their new form of government. They want to protect their religious, their Protestantism. They can't afford to lose these wars. And so what first starts to happen is that the English state begins to be able to raise more money through taxation than ever before, because while nobody's ever happy about paying taxes, there's a great deal more legitimacy to the reason for why the people are being taxed. And the fact that they have such authority and control over it is really important. But it also has a connected impact, which is that it turns out that if you can begin to reliably tax more, and so have an amount of revenue that you can always know you're going to have, and people know what taxes have been assessed, they know what amount of money the state is going to have every year. What the state can do is, rather than spend that money on, say, war material, what that state can instead do is use that money as a down payment to borrow a lot more money from taxpayers. So the taxes are something you don't have a choice about. That's sort of an involuntary confiscation by the state of a certain amount of your property, ostensibly, and in this case, truly, for reasons that you approve of. But when a state borrows, that's not coerced. I mean, no one has to lend money to the state. I mean, if you buy treasury bills today, this government doesn't make you do that. You want to do that. And what the English start saying is, look, if we ask people to lend us money now, what we'll promise to do is pay interest on what's been lent until such time as we can pay back the principal. And you can be confident that we can pay you the interest on what you lend because we're taxing more reliably and we have this revenue that we can use to pay it. And so very quickly, not only can the English state begin to tax more, but it can also begin to borrow a lot of upfront money and only pay interest rather than pay it back as a way to ward off the need to pay the money fully and use that money up front to fight wars that everybody believes are important to fight. And so what starts to happen over the course of the 18th century is that this ability to tax and this ability to borrow creates a much more robust and powerful British state that can begin to win most of these wars. With one exception, it wins all of the wars that are fought between 1689 and 1763. And the most important and significant of those, the 7 Years' War, what we call North America, the French Indian War, which is the most expensive and the most costly, and also the one that's fought most on North America. It's fought other places too, but North America has its biggest presence in that war. It has presences in all the earlier wars too, but this is the biggest one. At the end of that war, culminating in 1763, this new British state and British Empire have been so successful that they have actually conquered France in North America. It's conquered the French state, conquered all of French Canada. That's why it's now English, though Quebec still speaks French, but it's English, part of the English Commonwealth until it was an independent nation, but still part of the Commonwealth. And the French state sort of ceases to have a presence in North America. So this is like the ultimate victory, right? And the thing is that 6-decade process in which that's happening very much incorporates North America. North America becomes only more and more central and more significant to this process of sort of fighting and defending and ultimately even expanding the British Empire. In fact, in the 7 Years' War, initially, England captures all of the French West Indies and all of the Spanish West Indies as well. Gives it a lot of that back, but it certainly does conquer it. And a lot of people wish it hadn't given it back, right? So this is a real success story, which Americans are part of. But the other thing that the success story does is it also generates a huge degree of economic growth, right? I mean, these wars are incredibly costly. I mean, initially, when the English begin to borrow on extensive scales, in 1694, they create an act of parliament to float a loan for a little over £1 million. And they pay interest on this, and people subscribe to it, and they get £1 million up front to fight the war, which is very useful. And they pay an interest rate of around 8%. So the taxation doesn't have to tax £1 million; it just has to tax 8% of the million. That's how debt works. But by the end of the 7 Years' War in 1763, that debt had grown to about £135 million. So they borrowed huge amounts of money, which, again, remember, you can only borrow if people are voluntarily lending to you. So this suggests a confidence in the British state. People are actually confident that if they lend money to the British state, it will keep its promises. And there's a lot to do with the fact that the actual structure and system they're lending to is an elected legislative and therefore a body that's accountable to them through both election and through the laws of contract and through the expectations of the protection of property, which is much safer than, say, lending to a absolutist monarch who is only accountable to God, who you can't really hold accountable if, say, he doesn't keep his promises. And in fact, you can look at the way in which, when the French state tries to borrow over the same period of time, it will start off by cozying up to financiers and to merchants and saying nice things about them. And as soon as the wars end, it will start trashing them in the press and saying that they're predatory and they're the enemies of the people, and basically going back on its promises to pay. So it's very risky to pay to the French state. That doesn't happen with Britain. And the way you can measure this confidence in both Britain and North America in this British state is to see that as the debt rises, as I say, it goes from a little over £1 million in 1694 to around 135 million, a little under 133, 134 million pounds by 1763. But the interest the British state has to pay on that debt drops sharply. So they're paying 8% interest in 1694. And again, then as now, you have to pay more interest if the people lending you money have less confidence in you, right? If they feel that you're not going to be good for it, they want to get as much from you up front as they can, because they're not really confident that you're good to keep your promises. If you are being assessed lower interest, it's because the people lending to you have much more confidence in you as a debtor, and they feel that you'll keep your word and keep your promise. So the English state, the interest rate it has to pay drops from around 8% in 1694 to around 3% by 1763, means that people are growing in their confidence that if they lend to the British state, whatever promises it's made to them, it will keep. And so even though the debt is growing, you have to also understand that the economy is growing at a very fast rate, and the cost of borrowing is diminishing. So it's actually becoming a smaller challenge for this larger economy with a smaller interest rate to borrow, which is why the British can do so well at a time where the French state, which is always riskier because it is a different form of government, is continuing to pay very high interest rates, anywhere from 8 to 15% during the same period of time. So that's slowly weakening this French state through their victories. So what this leads to is the borrowing. I mean, the English state is borrowing so as to spend. I mean, that's the purpose of the borrowing. They're borrowing all this money to fight wars. And fighting wars means building lots of ships, employing lots of sailors, employing lots of soldiers, feeding and provisioning, clothing, and also having to do the same things in North America, which means there's a huge engine for mobilizing money and then spending it throughout the British Empire. It's a real engine of economic growth. And so what we can see over the course of the 18th century is both Britain and North America, through at the center of it, the state that exists to tax so as to borrow so as to spend, beginning to have larger and larger economies and a much, much, much more coherent imperial social and economic interconnected world. And what this means is that you get almost the reverse of what I described in the 17th century. What you get increasingly in the 18th century is a transatlantic community of English-speaking peoples who are much more connected than they've ever been before. One thing, there's a British state that is connecting them and is asking more and more of them, but it's asking them to do more and more for the purposes of building an imperial world that's actually providing them more and more. Right. So you can look at, the decades of the 1730s and 1740s, and you begin to see in both Britain and North America at the same time, the development of a kind of a lifestyle and a capacity to consume and purchase goods that would have been unthinkable even a generation before. And all of the kind of the world of the high world of colonial America that we kind of think of, the great houses in Philadelphia, If you've been to Virginia, Mount Vernon, I mean, all these great houses that people may have visited, they're still preserved now. If you go to the Powell House in Old City in Philadelphia, which is that's a really good example of that, all those buildings and structures date from the 1730s and 1740s or afterwards. They're not earlier than that. This is all the result of this world of consumption and outward exhibition of wealth and the capacity to sort of to consume, developing through the growth that is all happening through this imperial development post 1688. And so what that means is just all these different ways in which people on both sides of the ocean in North America and Britain can be doing the same things and feeling connected in ways they couldn't have been in the 17th century. That they consume a lot of the same goods, they build houses in the same styles, they read a lot of the same materials, they're getting the same art, they're fighting the same wars. And increasingly expectations of being part of a broad British subjecthood in an imperial community are rising and shaping mentality and ideas of selfhood in North America. Now, there's any number of examples of this, but I'll just sort of give you one to kind of move us ahead. So we've been paying attention to the American Revolution this year, and we all kind of know that, even if in a vague way, that there's certain kinds of conflicts that led to it, right? And so maybe we've heard about the demand for taxes, right? I mean, I've talked a lot about that increasingly the British state is demanding taxes from the North Americans, and they feel that this is unjust. And we've maybe heard about the quartering troops in private homes, right? I mean, imposing a British soldiery on North America, which is really repugnant and angering and leading to conflict. And so broadly, we kind of know that the American Revolution comes because of disagreements over whether or not North Americans should be taxed, and rising hostilities centering around the presence of the British Army. And the best example of this is a culmination like the Boston Massacre, right, where the British troops fire on and kill 5 people in Boston in March of 1770. So if we go back just a little bit before that, those events, the 1760s and 1770s, to that 7 Years' War. What's interesting about it's an interesting contrast, because all of the kinds of things that will cause conflict in the 1760s and 1770s are actually come up in the 7 Years' War as well, but get resolved in ways that work very well and actually build to greater harmony. So, for example, the 7 Years' War is actually more costly and more expensive in North America than anything that the British will expect North Americans to pay in taxes after that in the 1760s and 1770s. There's twice as many troops in North America during the 7 Years' War as there will be in the 1760s and 1770s. Wartime is more costly than peacetime. The expectation that the British ministry has of the North Americans is that they will contribute to some of the cost of the war through taxes, and that they will quarter and provide for troops, raise their own troops and quarter and provide for them from their own colonies, but also assist in paying for some of the North American costs of the 20,000 British troops. And the way that's done ultimately is that the person in charge of the war effort in the government, a man named William Pitt the Elder, because there's a younger William Pitt that comes along later, William Pitt the Elder, is rather than tax the colonies or seek to impose taxes through Parliament on the colonies, what he does is he requests that their own colonial governors ask the legislatures themselves if they'll tax on their own. And to incentivize them doing it, what he does is he sets aside a fund of gold and silver, it's called specie. That's the term for gold and silver. And each year that fund is, for the first few years, 200,000 pounds of gold and silver are put into that fund. And what he says is he promises that if the colonies will voluntarily tax themselves, they can draw upon that fund to reimburse a portion of what they tax themselves in gold and silver. It's a little complicated, so let me explain what this means. So when the colonies don't have very little gold and silver, I mean, classically, they produce raw materials. The British produced finished manufactured goods. When you ship raw materials out and you bring finished goods in, there's usually what's called an imbalance of trade because finished goods are more valuable. Now, it's not quite that simple, because you also have to know the West Indies is part of this, and there the North Americans ship a lot of more expensive goods to the West Indies than they purchase. So they always have a favorable balance of trade with the West Indies, which kind of offsets this. But the fact is that when you have an unfavorable balance of trade with somebody, which the North American colonies tend to do with Britain, the difference usually has to be made up with in gold and silver, right? If you have Massachusetts paper currency, that's not going to, no one's going to find that valuable in London, right? So if there's a debt to be paid at the end, it has to be in gold and silver. So gold and silver tends to leave the North American colonies, which can be a problem for paper currency economies, because the way they hold their value is if the body that's issuing them, and in this case it would be a colonial legislature, if you trust that that body has something of fixed value backing its paper currencies. If not, then they're not backed by anything, and then they'll become inflationary and they'll lose their value. People lose confidence in them. As they lose confidence in the currency, they'll demand more and more of it. Then you have to print more and more, and you get a lot of inflation. So you want to have gold and silver, and it's a problem for paper currencies that you don't have enough of it. So what Pitt is doing with this method is he's addressing that problem. What he's saying is, if you tax with your colonial paper money and you buy provisions with your colonial paper money, you can be reimbursed, in some cases up to 40% of what you've paid for, with gold and silver, which will then come back into your colonies and can become the basis for more stable and even more wider expanded paper currencies, which can increase the size of your economies. So what this does is it completely turns over the idea of taxation as something onerous. For one thing, it's the colonial legislatures who they're not being made to do this. It's just saying, if you do this yourselves, if you voluntarily choose to tax yourselves, you're eligible to draw upon the specie fund until it's exhausted each year. So this doesn't violate taxation without representation, right? Because colonial legislatures have been chosen by colonial taxpayers, and they have to pay the same taxes they expect taxpayers to pay. So it meets that requirement. And it also incentivizes them to want to tax themselves, because then they can draw upon the specie fund. And Pitt does the same thing with the quartering and provisioning of troops. He says, again, if you build barracks for the troops, if you provide for the troops, again, not all, but certainly for your own troops, and then a portion of the British troops, the 20,000 British troops stationed in North America, you can also draw upon a specie fund to be reimbursed up to 30 to 40% of your expenses. And the result is that the colonial legislatures eagerly quarter troops and provide for troops. So all of these things that will cause friction and conflict in the 1760s don't necessarily have to. Right? They can be done in ways that go with the colonists' sense of their own British liberties. Now, note here, the reason you have to do that is because increasingly, experiencing this empire as they have over the last 6 decades, the colonists have become convinced that they are as British as anybody. They also should have taxation with representation. They also should have their rights to property respected. They also need to have their British liberties protected by the government that exists to protect British liberty. That's the purpose of this limited constitutional monarchy. It applies to them just as much as it applies to anybody living in Britain. They're British subjects too, which is why they know that these are rights they should have. And what's clear is that someone like William Pitt accepts that, acknowledges that. He is structuring the demands that the imperial state needs to make. I mean, it has to fight these wars. It has to beat France. Nobody disputes that. You don't want to, I don't know if anybody's seen that wonderful movie Master and Commander with Russell Crowe. It was a while back, but there's a great scene in that movie where Russell Crowe is playing the British admiral, and they're about to fight the French, and he calls his men to the deck to rouse them to fight. And he says, "Do you want that raggedy ass Napoleon to be your king? Do you want a guillotine in Piccadilly? Do you want your children growing up singing the Marseillaise?" They're like, "No, my God, the worst possible thing we could ever imagine." Okay, well, that's Napoleon, so that's generation later. But that's the mentality, right? I mean, we can't lose to the French. They're absolutist Catholic tyrants. It'd be terrible. Everybody in North America agrees with that, right? Which means that the last thing you should be doing in fighting this absolutist Catholic monarchical tyrant is violating your own values, right? You're existing to defend your values. So you have to figure out a way to structure that fight that also is in keeping with British values and ideals. And that's largely what Pitt manages to do. We're good, right? 140. Wait, how long have I been going?
I'm not sure. It's not showing me on the side, but
you're fine. Okay. Okay, great. You can edit that part out or not. I don't know. I don't even know. So one thing you want to see is that it's not as if from the beginning, or just by definition, North American air or soil or atmosphere makes people opposed to the idea of paying taxes. In fact, during the 7 Years' War, the North Americans taxed themselves at higher levels than in the next decade will be demanded of them. We'll talk about why they get demanded in a little bit. It's not the amount of taxation that they're objecting to. It's the way in which those taxes are violating their own sense of their British selfhood and their own sense of what British liberty is. It's also not the case that they're necessarily hostile to the British military. In many ways, the British military is seen as the heroes of the age, especially the Navy, which is protecting this British world from its enemies, which nobody in North America would doubt at the end of the 7 Years' War were clearly on the outside of the empire, not on the inside. In many ways, the British Empire reaches its high point in 1763, and North Americans had never done more to contribute to what they see as this glorious victory, which is finally, really, it's no exaggeration in their minds, is the victory of the forces of Christ over the forces of Antichrist, right? and the popish religion of Antichrist. Now, the thing is, though, there's a couple of ways to think about this, right? So if you're William Pitt, and I personally think this is actually the more reasonable and sensible way to think about it. If you're William Pitt, what you say is, well, look, North America is sometimes difficult to govern. It's 3,000 miles in an ocean away. It's over 1 million people, which means it's already a third the size of Britain itself, and it's doubling in population every 20 years. It's unlike any other colony in any other empire, including ours, in the world. And people talk about it that way. They know that North America is this vast space with this vast population, in a way that no other colonies in France, Spain, or any other British colonies are. And that's a challenge, right? That means that, no other colonies are being asked or could be expected to raise thousands of troops, to have these governments that are actually contributing major policy-making interventions to the British Empire. All these other colonies, these much smaller West Indian colonies, are having that done for them by the British. North America is something different, and that means certain kinds of challenges in many ways because it has the largest population of people who are convinced of their own Britishness living far away from Britain itself, which means that you have to figure out kind of special conditions for how to make sure that British liberties work there, right? And so what Pitt says is, yeah, that's a challenge, but in the end, what did we want? We want to win a war. We want the colonists to contribute to the war. We want the colonists to respect and support the British military. And they did all of those things. And yeah, for a few years, we subsidized them £200,000 a year. And when the war shifted to the West Indies and less was asked of them, we still asked some of them and we reduced it a bit. But in the end, we probably all together from the mid 1750s to the early 1760s, we reimbursed about £1 million in specie, says Pitt. Now, we have a public debt of £133 million, which means that 133rd of that went to the North Americans. That's what it cost to win all of North America, to defeat the French in North America. There's really no better return on investment than you can get. This is a tiny fraction of what we are capable of borrowing and spending, and what we've spent everywhere else in the world over the course of these centuries. Very little of it in North America. They're very cheap, and the return is great. And so that's an example of our great imperial strength. On the other hand, it was also clear that North Americans would not accept or respect the claim that Parliament itself had the same sovereign authority over them in the realm of taxation that, say, it did over British people living in Britain. And the reason for that, the colonists would say, is the reason why Pitt's methods are the ones that must be followed is because you have to figure out a way to get us to contribute our share to the empire in ways that don't violate our British liberties. And the problem is that while Parliament is the ultimate example of the protection of British liberty, when it taxes British people living in Britain, precisely because they do elect people to the House of Commons, and the members of the House of Commons would have to pay the same taxes in Britain that they levied on people in Britain, neither of those things are true for North Americans. North Americans don't send anybody to Parliament. In fact, we're now getting to be such a large population that if we were really to send over enough people to make it a meaningful thing, we'd need at least a third of the members of Parliament at this point. That would cost more than any taxes we would pay. It's just not feasible. And because we don't send people to Parliament, and by definition, a member of Parliament who taxes, say, Pennsylvania would never have to pay those taxes, neither of those conditions for British liberty are met, which is why only our own colonial legislatures should tax us. Now, that is not, as we've just seen, preventing the colonists from contributing a great deal to the empire. What you do is you approach them in the way Pitt did. But what Pitt saw as strength, again, 3,000 miles in an ocean away without any real ability to force them to do it, you get colonists to contribute a lot to the empire. Other policymakers could see as weakness, right? Here's the colonists, in fact, saying there are limits to Parliament's authority and power, when in fact it's that claim of that power and authority of Parliament that allowed them to limit the king way back in 1688. So this is a challenge. This is a difficult kind of riddle, a conundrum, because if the colonists are limiting Parliament's power and saying that it can't do things to them in order to keep itself separate and distinct and independent from the king, does that weaken Parliament's capacity to be independent of the king? And what other members of Parliament ask is, well, wait, then what exactly is the colonist relationship to the king? Do they have a direct relationship with the king that bypasses Parliament? They're a big wealthy group of taxpayers too. Could they pay taxes directly to the king? And if they did that, wouldn't that weaken Parliament's ability to limit the power of the king? So there's potential challenges here having this kind of unique form of empire with this huge, vast population of people who also think they're British. There's great benefits, as we've seen, and tremendous benefits, right? I mean, they can raise more money, they can bring to bear more people, they can defeat the French and the Spanish in North America. But it also means that there are challenges to having these kind of colonies that other empires just don't face. And increasingly, what we see in the 1760s and 1770s is people coming into authority and power as Pitt is pushed out of power, who think differently from him, who are more fearful about the way in which the colonists' claims to their own Britishness are actually limiting the authority of Parliament, rather than Pitt, who figures out ways to balance all of those things to bring the colonists voluntarily to where he wants them to be. Increasingly, what policymakers who follow him are saying, with some exceptions, but for the most part, what policymakers are saying is actually it's really dangerous to have a growing number of colonists who think that they can exempt themselves, carve themselves out from parliamentary authority and sovereignty, because it's only parliamentary sovereignty and authority that is actually allowing us to hold the king in check and limit him. And if it's weakened, then we run the risk of possibly reviving the kind of monarchy that we thought we got rid of. So what you see increasingly in the 1760s and 1770s is policymakers like George Grenville, who starts this, and then Lord North, we'll talk about him later, increasingly making demands that are very much not in the Pitt tradition. And this is where famous events come in that you've probably heard about, like the Stamp Act of 1765 and the Quartering Act of 1764, which, note, the Stamp Act and also the Sugar Act, which is a little less famous, but we'll focus on the Stamp Act. I mean, those taxes are meant to raise money to fund the troops that are staying in North America after the war. And the Quartering Act, as it sounds, is an act that imposes the demand upon the colonies to tax themselves, to pay taxes through a demand of Parliament to quarter troops. Now, we've just seen is funding troops and quartering troops is not in itself a problem. That's just what they have done. It's the way in which it's now happening. Because now, rather than getting the colonists to decide they want to do it, voluntarily taxing themselves through their own colonial legislatures, what Parliament is doing is passing laws insisting the colonists have to pay directly taxes that Parliament has imposed. And that immediately raises the concern that any British subject now knows to express, which is, well, wait, if a body that I don't send representatives to and that isn't paying the taxes it's demanding of me has the authority to tax me, why couldn't it, in theory, begin to tax me in ways that would begin to really ruin me or undermine me, or possibly, in theory, tax away my property to the point where I was no longer a free property-owning person? In fact, I might even be, in the extreme version, they say that might enslave me. And so they use this terminology, which is fascinating because they have examples of real slavery all around them. And so they can see, in many ways, because of their own actions of what they've perpetrated, what it would look like to lose their rights. And they can fear that this might be done to them, not just by them. Right. So sometimes you often get slave owners themselves saying, I myself should not be enslaved, which is what would happen if Parliament could claim this authority. But what I want to suggest is that this is a very British conversation. The only ways in which they understand why what's being done to them in their minds is wrong, and the very ways in which they can mobilize arguments against it, is because they've so embraced their own British identity. That's why they have the right to taxation without representation. That's why they can have the expectation that a government should exist to protect their property rights and their liberties rather than violate them. Because they live in a limited constitutional monarchy too. It's just that because of the particular circumstances and conditions in which they do, 3,000 miles in an ocean away, with challenges that no other British subjects have, that has to be acknowledged, and conditions have to be met to meet those challenges. That can be done. Pitt did it under even more difficult circumstances, literally during wartime, but it's not being done in the 1760s and 1770s. And so what you get increasingly is the colonists having to explain how a British empire works and how their own British subjecthood fits within it. And increasingly what they fall back to is the cardinal British right of no taxation without representation. They say again and again and again, whenever Parliament tries to pass taxes in 1764 and 65, and then again between 1767 and 1770 with a series of taxes called the Townshend Acts, what they say is Parliament cannot tax us because doesn't represent us in the way that British subjects must be represented by any body that will tax them. And what we want, they say again and again and again, is not to be independent of the British Empire. We want the British Empire to go back to the world that we used to have, that we liked so much. And again, that world is not the distant past of the 17th century when, as I've said, there was more Americanness than Britishness. It's the world of the decade before. So we want to go back to in fact, if you read these pamphlets, you'll say they will often say, we were content until 1763. We want to go back to the world of 1763. We want a restoration. Indeed, one of the most powerful critics of the taxes of 1767, the Townshend Acts taxes, is a man named John Dickinson from Pennsylvania, who writes letters of a Pennsylvania farmer. And at one point, I believe it's the second letter, is a series of letters, but in the second letter, in an effort to denounce the Townshend Acts, he describes them as an innovation. He says these are an innovation. And that's a really useful word to think about for a moment, because that has always suggested to me the almost exact opposite of what we would think of as revolutionary consciousness. What he's opposed to is change. What he wants is restoration. He's literally conservative. He wants to conserve a world that he believes he had, in many ways did have, and wants to go back to it. And what I would argue is that as long as that's the goal, even as it gets angrier, I mean, they get angrier and they get more frustrated and they get less confident as time goes by that Britain will go back. But as long as that remains the demand, no taxation without representation, stop this innovation, restore the world we used to like, that is a population of people who's not seeking revolution and not seeking independence. What they're seeking is to maintain the British Empire that they were largely content with. Now, what that means is what they want is Parliament to limit itself to those places where they do acknowledge that it has authority. And we've seen Parliament has increasingly had more presence in their lives in the 18th century, much more in the 17th century. Parliament has coordinated wars, right? Parliament has provided the money that has subsidized their willingness to tax. Increasingly, Parliament has overseen the laws that structure the British Empire they're part of. The most famous of these are the Navigation Acts, which structure all British subjects, regardless of where they live, England, Scotland, the West Indies, North America, structure them within a sort of a commercial alliance in which they're required to commercially conduct their commercial business within the British Empire and not outside of it, to ship to other parts of the British Empire, to use ships built in the British Empire, to use crews that are 75% British subjects. And increasingly the colonists are buying into that, right? I mean, that's allowing them access to this vast, increasingly large and wealthy empire that needs their goods, that provides ready markets for what they produce, that supplies them with the goods that are becoming evidence of their own Britishness and their own increasing wealth and comfort and ease. Those are all things Parliament is doing too, and those are not sources of conflict, right? They're not. There's no Navigation Acts riots. There's no Navigation Acts pamphlets in the same way there are riots against the Stamp Act, denunciations of these taxes. So increasingly what they're saying when they say we want to go back to 1763 is we want to go back to the world where Parliament confined itself to doing the things that we agree it should be doing, that are legitimate actions that it should do upon all British subjects, including us. No British subject should be trading with the French and enriching and empowering the French. That would be wrong, right? We shouldn't do that. No British subject should be undermining, British institutions. So Parliament should, in fact, legislate the behavior of all British subjects, regardless of where they live, for the betterment of all British peoples. The one thing Parliament shouldn't do, they say, is it shouldn't violate its own values, violate its own liberties, which it would be doing if it, as an unrepresentative body, it tried to tax the British subjects of the king living in North America. So don't innovate, just go back to the world of 1763. And for the longest time, from the start of these conflicts, which again, just to remind you, don't have to be conflicts, right? I mean, the same conditions the same challenges were faced in the 7 Years' War and were met very well. But as these conflicts are growing in the 1760s and 1770s, what the colonists when they say no taxation without representation, denouncing the taxes, but still continuing to abide by the Navigation Acts and other legislation, what they're saying is we want to go back to the world where Parliament legislates for us, regulates the behavior of all British subjects for the good of the British Empire, but doesn't tax us because that violates our liberties. And what this builds to is eventually Parliament believe it or not, actually usually kind of backing away from its taxes. The Stamp Act leads to such violence and such riots that they repeal it. Eventually, the Townshend Acts, which are taxes on British goods being shipped to America, a lot of the commodities they buy from Britain, window glass, various kinds of paints, and tea is a big one. Eventually, that leads to boycotts because they're trying to demonstrate that they won't buy taxed goods, and they repeal most of those. They keep the tax on tea, but that's it. And then, in a roundabout way, as Parliament tries to kind of bring in taxed tea in 1773, this leads famously, that's why there's famously a Boston Tea Party. It's one of the few goods left that's still being taxed. It's a complex story. I'm going on for a while, so I don't have time for it. Just enough to know that it's still a taxed good. And in Boston, some colonists decide to destroy the taxed tea as a demonstration that they won't accept Parliament's authority to tax them. And at this point, Parliament is pretty fed up because the taxes are not actually that high. And most members of Parliament believe they do have the authority. It's in fact, their obligation and duty to be the sole taxing agent in the British Empire so as to make sure they can remain independent of the king. They think that they're preserving British liberty by exercising their authority to tax. And so when the tea is destroyed in Boston Harbor, and it's about $1.5 million worth of tea in contemporary today's dollars, so it's a lot of tea, they decide to punish Boston and Massachusetts. And so in 1774, they pass a series of acts, which Parliament itself calls the coercive acts. So Parliament's not hiding that these are pretty tough acts. I mean, they're calling them coercive. And the Americans call them the intolerable acts. Now, again, I say I hadn't really prepared, so let me see if I can get all four of these acts from memory. So the first act there's 4 coercive acts. And the first is the Boston Port Act, which closes the port of Boston until the city of Boston pays for all the tea. Now, over half of the city of Boston is employed by the port, and everybody else is employed because that half's employed. So the British know that this is a really punitive punishment. There'll be a very long time before Boston can pay for the tea. They're essentially saying we're so angry and we're so displeased with their behavior, we're going to shut down this city for the time being. And the second is called the Administration of Justice Act. And what the Administration of Justice Act does is, one, it makes the commander of the British forces, military forces in Boston, the governor of Massachusetts, so General Thomas Gage. So it creates a military governor, and also sharply limits the number of town meetings there can be, and says that if there's a crime, if a British agent of the state commits a crime, that crime would be tried in an admiralty court, in a naval court, rather than a civilian court. Now, what the colonists are remembering is the Boston Massacre of a few years before. They're saying if something like that were to happen now, if soldiers were to fire into a crowd and kill people, it would be the British military that would be trying them, and presumably would be quite lenient. So they call it the Murder Act. It's encouraging violence against us. So it seems and it's also placing civilians under kind of military governance and military legal authority, which is seen as a real violation of British liberty. And the third is called the Massachusetts Government Act. I kind of elided those two. Again, it's off the cuff. So some of the stuff that I said was the Administration of Justice Act is really the Massachusetts Government Act. What the Massachusetts Government Act does is that's what makes Gage governor. So it puts a military leader in command, governor of the colony. And it forcibly changes the Massachusetts charter, colonial charter, which dated all the way back to 1691. And it now makes the king have much more authority over appointing the Massachusetts government. So it's really increasing royal authority in Massachusetts and limiting popular government in Massachusetts, the government elected by the people. And then the fourth act is a much stronger quartering act, which not only obligates colonists, forces them to pay for troops, but also gives the governor, who is now also the commander of those troops, Gage, the authority to quarter troops in private homes. This is the first time this has happened, if colonists don't provide alternative barracks for them. So those 4 acts are shocking to not just Boston and Massachusetts, but all North Americans, because trial by jury, civilian authority over the military, the English common law notion that one's home is one's castle, that people cannot intrude, those are seen as the most fundamental of British liberties. And now what this is conveying is that Parliament believes that its sovereignty extends to the point where it can actually legislate away British liberty itself. The other thing to note here is that these 4 acts, which collectively make up the coercive acts, right, the the Massachusetts Governing Act, the Administration of Justice Act, the Quartering Act, and the Boston Port Act. None of those are taxes. They're not raising any money. In fact, the Boston Port Act is the opposite of a tax, right? It's denying the British state revenue would probably get if it kept the port open. These are all examples of legislation, which does fall into the arena that colonists had always said Parliament ought to do. They said one thing it shouldn't do is tax us. It should regulate behavior and pass laws governing behavior for the benefit of the empire. The way it would violate our liberty is if it taxed away our property without accountability, without representation, to the point where we no longer could feel our property was safe. So what we want is a parliament that merely legislates but doesn't tax. But the problem now, in other words, what we don't want is innovation. We want to go back. The problem is that now what Parliament is claiming is that the very authority it has to legislate can lead to things like the coercive acts, which are greater threats to their sense of British liberty than any tax would have been. And so what the coercive acts in 1774 convey to the members of colonial colonists, not just in Massachusetts, because they figure they can do it in Massachusetts, they can do it anywhere, is that actually it's even more dangerous to give Parliament the authority to legislate. It shouldn't be able to do that either. Now, if you've already always said Parliament can't tax, but now you're also saying that it can't legislate, taxation and legislation combined is everything government does. That is everything that government does. And if Parliament can't do any of that, then it can't govern the colonies. And the inescapable logic there is, well, then you're independent of Parliament. That's a huge move towards independence. Also note that that's something different than what I said before. Now the colonists have become the innovators. Now they're reimagining their relationship with the British state, which is proto-revolutionary consciousness.
I have a quick question. And
sure.
Again, this is off the cuff, so I don't know if you would
sure.
know off the top of your head, but I know there were other like revolutionary acts with tea. There's the Greenwich tea burning. There's other people throwing tea into their own harbors. Other intolerable or coercive acts in those other places, or was Boston kind of like the example?
Yeah, no, I mean, so there are smaller examples of destruction of tea, though Boston's is in many ways the most prominent. And also, what's more often the case, and actually, I guess I could answer that question. It's a good question. I'll tell a little more of the story. So, the Tea Act is an interesting act in that, when all of the Townshend Acts have been put in place, that's lots of goods coming from England. It was actually hard to maintain a boycott of them because you don't really know. You're looking at ships coming in with these huge crates and these huge barrels, and you don't really know what's in them. So you don't really know like what goods are taxed and what aren't. And you kind of have to boycott everything, and that's hard. So you actually see those boycott movements that we all talk about are actually don't last for very long, and they're very hard to sustain, and they don't. And then usually the colonists set consumption records the year after they're ended and undo any damage they might have done within a year. The Tea Act's interesting because at this point, largely it's all been boiled down to tea. That's really the only good that's still being taxed. And part of the Tea Act in a complicated way is that it's also meant to boost the fortunes of the British East India Tea Company, which is granted a monopoly of the right to wholesale tea in North America. So this allows you to ignore most of the other ships and goods in any harbor because now it's really only one company and it's really only one commodity and you kind of know what they are. It's also the case that with a lot of these harbors, I mean, Philadelphia, where I'm talking from, is a good example. I mean, everybody knows Philadelphia. We know that Philadelphia is not on the ocean, actually. It's, inland from the Delaware River. And it actually takes an ocean-going vessel. Once it's sighted off the coast, it'll be anywhere from 3 to 4 days or even sometimes more before it actually comes into the harbor, sailing up the river, guided by very skilled river pilots. So people can move much faster than that from the coast to the city, reporting exactly what these ships are and exactly what's on them, so that everybody knows if an East India ship with tea is coming well before it actually arrives. So Philadelphia is a good example of this. There's a good event where, and this committee is literally called the Committee for Tarring and Feathering. I mean, that's what the committee is called, that will meet these ships on the harbor and they can just focus on the tea ships and basically warn them to go away and remind them of who they are. And at that point, if you're afraid, if you're a ship captain, you don't want to land your tea. The British Empire, as I've suggested, becoming a pretty modern professionalizing enterprise. Nobody gets to go anywhere without papers. You have papers that allow you to come into a harbor. You have to have papers to allow you to leave. At that point, what most ship captains will do is request from harbor masters and customs men permission to sail, and they're usually granted that. In this Philadelphia case, they were, because people don't want the worst to come to the worst, right? So what's happened in Boston is that by that point, the lieutenant governor, a man named Thomas Hutchinson, is had it with what he sees as the lawlessness of his fellow Bostonians. And so when these 3 tea ships come in December of 1773 and they're warned, go away, and they request papers, he tells the harbor master not to give them the papers to sail. So these ships are not kind of stuck in the harbor without the right to leave. And at that point, what happens in maritime law is that a clock starts. If a ship has not unloaded but cannot leave, within 2 weeks, its cargoes will be seized and brought to the port and sold at public auction. So what Hutchins is doing is he's trying to force the issue. He's trying to get the tea on shore, because in complicated ways, this Tea Act is a really interestingly structured act. Believe it or not, the price that the British East India Company is required to charge in North America has actually lowered the price of tea. It's never been cheaper than it had been before in ways that are interesting and complicated. And indeed, what Hutchinson's banking on is he's saying, if we can just get the tea on shore, it's the Sons of Liberty, people, troublemakers like Sam Adams, were preventing that tea from getting here. But I'm confident that Bostonian consumers will want cheaper tea, and that will undermine the claim that people like that Sam Adams have, that they speak for the people. What's interesting is that with a few days to go at a town meeting, Sam Adams says, basically, we can't let the tea get on land because they're going to buy it, and then we'll look foolish, and we'll have undermined the claim that we speak for the. He thinks that Hutchinson's right, which is why they destroy the tea in Boston, because they don't want it to get on land. They don't want it to get sold. So that now what's interesting is that the British are paying attention. What they decide is, well, this is purely one colony. We're going to notice all these coercive acts are just aimed at the city of Boston and the province of Massachusetts. What they're saying is, what we're going to do is we're going to show the rest of these colonies that we can be reasonable, right? It's only when this really troublemaking colony with a few bad apples, these Adamses and this Hancock and these other guys, if we can just show you that this won't happen to you if you don't act this way, if you just are good law-abiding subjects, then we can be able to put the empire back together again. But the coercive acts are such a shocking, the idea, I don't think it ever occurred to any North American that Parliament believed that its sovereign authority included being able to actually legislate away what they saw as fundamental British liberties. That clearly at the First Continental Congress, when they meet in 1774, none of these colonists, representatives of the colonies, feel they're safe, and they do feel that they're also in danger. But what's interesting is that in this moment where these, not all 12 of the 13 colonies come together in this First Continental Congress 1774 in response to the coercive acts, it's there they begin to realize that they've become the innovators. I mean, what they really are saying is that Parliament can't tax or legislate for them. And so if they're going to remain in the empire, they're going to have to carve out some sort of independent connection directly with the king, which, remember, had been Parliament's worst fear all along, and with denying Parliament any authority at all. But they also realize that being British subjects of the empire has been the best deal. I mean, nobody wants to go back to the horrible days of the late 17th century, which, again, as I suggest, were more American, right? They really want to keep this British commercial relationship. And so if you look at the statement that they send to the king, this First Continental Congress, what they do is they deny Parliament any authority to tax or legislate. They have to do that because the coercive acts cannot be allowed. And the problem is that the navigation acts, which they've always liked, come from that same authority to legislate. So if you're now they realize, well, wait, do we have to give up those and give up on those if we're denying the power to legislate? So what they say is that Parliament has no power to either tax them or legislate them, but that the colonists of their own volition will cheerfully consent to continue to abide by any laws passed by Parliament that are solely for the purpose of regulating their external commerce, which is the Navigation Act. The saying is, we'll actually keep those, and we'll stay in this relationship with you as long as you acknowledge that Parliament doesn't have any power to do anything to us, which is why it requires our cheerful consent. Those are the words they use, cheerful consent. So what I suggest again is that that's how British they still are. That they really don't want to leave behind what they see as the best parts of the British Empire, this commercial relationship. Now, there's no way King and Parliament are just not going to take that deal. I mean, they get this, they reject it. The colonists had the First Continental Congress had ended in September, having sent this offer saying we'll meet again in May of 1775 and see where we are. And obviously 1 month before that, Selection and Concord, they come back and they're at a war, and Washington shows up with his old French and Indian 7 Years' War uniform, and I think we'll put him in charge of the troops. Which reminds me, at the end of the 7 Years' War, Washington had been so happy about his youthful service that he'd actually sought a commission as an officer in the British Army. And I've always thought it was a great counterfactual speculation. What if Britain had said, yeah, that guy's not bad, we'll take him. India, you need him there. And they'd send him off, right? I mean, that would have probably been a different world. You never would have heard of him, right? But anyway, I mean, they didn't take him. He never got in. He's got this uniform. And the point is that the situation is now fundamentally changed. And once the war starts and it gets more and more like a war and it becomes more and more violent and more conflicted, the colonists become more and more and more angrier and angrier. They certainly use disaffection. They now have disaffection. There's no way they're going to want to have any relationship with Britain. But what's interesting is that if you jump ahead a few years, 1778, Franklin has negotiated the French alliance. The French have decided to intervene, and they'd always been quietly intervening, but now they're actually going to recognize the United States. They're going to provide military support. And this now becomes another one of those major world wars that France and Britain are fighting, but this time with North America on the side of France. And the British do become concerned. They begin to be worried that they're too stretched, they're too thin, they're worried about their own West Indian colonies. They have to pull resources out. It looks like suddenly this is not maybe a winnable situation for them. And what's interesting is in that year, they offer essentially the same deal back to the North American colonists. The North American colonists had offered to them in 1774. Now it's too late. The Americans are so angry and so alien and disaffected that they'll accept nothing short of independence. But it's only 4 years, right? And so you can think for a little bit, and on this is like, what if that 4-year gap had been closed? What if Britain had been willing to do in 1774 what it in fact was willing to do in 1778? Said, yeah, okay, we'll reorganize the empire so that you are under the British authority for oceanic commercial navigation, and have increasingly will acknowledge your independent sovereignty and autonomy. What they would have created in the late 18th century is largely what the British 19th century Commonwealth Empire becomes. One where those equivalent white settler colonies, Canada, Australia, for a while South Africa, are granted more and more internal autonomy and sovereignty while they remain within a broad global commercial empire, which, in other words, Britain learns a lot of lessons from this, debacle, from the destruction of its first British Empire, and structures its second British Empire largely along the lines that people were glimpsing and grasping towards. And even sometimes, if you think about the way that William Pitt was operating, kind of in a de facto way, offering. I mean, Pitt was giving them a lot of internal autonomy and, to broadly fit within a broad commercial empire. They just didn't really have a belief system to explain it or articulate it. But what the experience of the breakup of this British Empire in the 18th century does is provide them with the language and the examples and the evidence to build their empire in the 19th century, which then does lead to Britain's global hegemony for the next century. So they come out of this learning some serious lessons and doing pretty well. And the Americans come out of it with their own country, which for now, at least, we still have. So that's good too. So I don't know. I mean, Tia had said provide some context. So that's my effort to do that. Any questions, Tia? Anything else you want?
I think I'm all good. I learned a lot. I mean, this isn't my area by any means. So the entire time you're talking, I'm like, wait, really?
That's good. That's great.
But yeah, I think that's really interesting because, I mean, definitely looking at it at the revolution, there is the conception of, oh, but we're just too American and we need to get away because we're just too different.
Right.
So looking at it with the context of like, no, they tried to be their own different thing and they realized we don't like that too much. Let's
Right. Yeah. And so, I mean, this is in many ways a deeply British conversation that only people who feel their deep Britishness could be having, which in no way means there can't be a great deal of conflict. There is a great deal of conflict, but it also is this sort of Britishness being kind of filtered through some unique and special challenging conditions, right? I mean, vast space, vast distance. How exactly in the 18th century, when distance means a great deal of time as well, how exactly does governance work? How exactly are institutions that are not meant to govern over such a vast distance and a vast space function? And what the experience of the 18th century show is that they're, people who kind of figure out the challenges, like Pitt, can make them function very well with really successful outcomes. And then there are ways in which, if you think differently from people like him, where you approach the colonists in ways that don't really probably pay enough careful attention to or respect for the particular kinds of challenges of distance and space and vast population size, you can really mess things up. So in many ways, I think the 18th century provides really powerful examples. The 7 Years' War would be the most clearest of it, of how you can keep an empire, and you really could keep an empire, but also provides examples of how in the end they do what they do, which is how they lose an empire. But then learning some real lessons from it in ways that allow them to not make those mistakes in the 19th century, and they do keep that empire for a lot longer and to the great benefit of British people, at least many British people, not so much to the benefit of a lot of other people.
Sun never sets.
Yeah, right, for a while, and then it did. Right,
and then it did.
Yeah. Yeah. Although what's interesting is that a lot of the sharpest challenges, not surprisingly, in that Second British Empire come from the people who they don't acknowledge
Mhm.
as British, right? I mean, essentially the non-white
Mhm.
places with non-white majorities, right, which are not granted the same kind of autonomy. So while the British Empire is the first empire to stop being a slave-owning space, I mean, they famously end slavery 30 years, and without a huge, vast, violent civil war, they end slavery 30 years before the North American colonies. They certainly don't end their sharp distinction between white and non-white peoples, and
Mhm.
that comes back to really should provide them the sharpest challenges in the 20th century in places like India and then in much of and in Africa.
Mhm. And to kind of touch on that, I thought it was interesting when you mentioned the anxiety that colonists had about, oh, they could tax my property away and then I will be enslaved.
Yeah.
This idea of enslaving people and see, it's just interesting to remember that they were aware of the systems. They were
Well,
aware of.
yeah. And so what's interesting is you see that, like, in many ways, there's a lot going on there,
Mhm.
obviously. And some of it is just deciding to just have very selective, consciousness. But also, I think in certain ways, there's two. We also want to see that, that there's kind of two trajectories of slavery they're thinking about, because the slavery that we're all thinking about that is most applicable to the story we're telling is very much a modern slavery.
Mhm.
Modern slavery that really develops, in the 15th and 16th centuries around the African trade, and is primarily about forcibly moving people away over vast periods of time and using up their bodies, often using them in the West Indies, their bodies up until they're dead,
Mhm.
purely as sort of, element, sort of incidences of sort of wealth creation for those who have enslaved them, which is a much more brutal, frankly, and totalizing and violent form of slavery than slavery of antiquity, which is, often not based on race. It can be it can be certainly based on identifying people as enslavable, but, like,
Mhm.
there's a period of time in the ancient world where, like, for example, on the Roman stage, in order to depict somebody as a slave, you'd have them wear a red wig, because red hair was seen as a slavish characteristic. One thing, a lot of Irish people are enslaved by their own, and
Mhm.
so, in other words, I mean, slavish characteristics are not, I mean, they settle upon sub-Saharan Africans in the 15th and 16th centuries, but they're, in fact, initially it comes from it's these people of the Slavish
Mhm.
lands who are slaves, right? And so, one way in which, coming out of antiquity, the conception, the ancient world, the conception of being enslaved, and when slavery is wrong, it's when somebody who shouldn't have been enslaved becomes enslaved. And so in other words, when they say, like, in other words, the enslavement, they said that's what would be happening to us, is that would be wrong in a way it wouldn't be for those who have slavish characteristics, which is now settled
Mhm.
on sub-Saharan Africans. They've decided, because we were people who at one point had liberty and then lost it, through no fault of our own, right? Lost it because of governments behaving badly, right? Now, what's interesting is that's all subjective
Mhm.
construction, right? And it's pretty easy to challenge. And what's interesting is you see moments almost immediately where these two different conceptions of slavery kind of collapse in upon each other. So one of my favorite is an example from the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act has been passed. It's this first parliamentary tax. In the ways we talked about, you say, like, if you non-representative body taxing you, taking away all your property, you lose your liberty, you're enslaved. That would be terrible. And so, they say, one of the cries that's been made is liberty, liberty, and no stamp paper. And this word liberty is kind of being spread throughout communities. And so, one point, a man named Henry Lawrence, who is one of the largest slaveholders in South Carolina, and who is opposed to the Stamp Act. Initially, people think he might not be, but he proves that he is. He's saying liberty, liberty, no stamp paper, and I won't be enslaved. And he's writing. His letters are preserved. So there's a letter he writes, I should say. So in the 18th century, where there was not reliable mail service, more reliable than you might think, but not like what we're used to. A letter was more like an experience, right? You'd usually write a letter over a period of weeks, because you don't write a lot of letters. There's not a lot of paper, so you may as well work your recipients well. You want to give them a lot of, you can't just do a FaceTime or get on the phone, right? So what's interesting is you can sort of see, you can sometimes chart, like, almost day by day, like a person's life for the period of time they're writing the letter. So at the start of the letter, he's talking about how there have been Stamp Act riots and opposition. The Stamp Act will not work. in Charleston where he's living, liberty, liberty, no stamp paper. And then, a week or so later, he picks up the letter again. He says, oh, there's been a group of kind of, this is his description, rowdy boys and Negroes who've been marching throughout the town, chanting liberty, liberty, liberty. And he says, nah, they're just a bunch of rabble, and I don't really think they even know what the word means. They're just imitating their betters. But, we historians read those documents. We often read documents. We not usually, boys and enslaved people don't write letters. So we have to rely upon, the only source we have is Henry Lawrence. And so what we do is we call reading against the grain. Say, like, what is he revealing he doesn't know to reveal? And there, doesn't know he's revealing. And what I think he's revealing there is a sense of anxiety. Right, he really hopes they don't know what it means, but it's stuck in his conscience enough that he's writing it to the person who's going to receive this letter, saying, "Oh, these black people are marching in Charleston, shouting liberty because that's in the air. And do they really mean the Stamp Act? Maybe they do, maybe they don't." And he just says, "Well, they don't really know what it means. It's not a big deal." But then later on the letter, he just mentions, he doesn't refer back to this crowd of enslaved people chanting liberty, but he simply he sort of just mentions that even though the weather has turned very bad and very cold, he and others have been riding out on patrol night and day. They go, what are they riding out on patrol for? Well, I think they're worried that there might be unrest within the slave populations. So in many ways, what I say is what's interesting here is that there's a collapse of this, right? I mean, almost immediately, this distinction between who should be enslaved and who's not, that language can be really overwhelm those distinctions. And, if it's going to be publicly proclaimed or be placed at the center of a conversation or even at the center of a culture, and it is, as the revolution gets further and further along, possibilities for that are only going to mount and increase. And so in many ways, what the revolution is going to do, whether or not you intend it to, I mean, Henry Lawrence doesn't intend it to do this, but the very language of the revolution, the very arguments you have to make to challenge the British government are also going to have the ability to challenge some of the institutions that the initial articulators of that language wouldn't want to have seen challenged. And in that sense, what I argue is that lots of different people begin through their own use of that language and their own claim in that language, they lay claim to a sense of ownership of their own revolution. And that's also very much the story of the American Revolution. And maybe even in the end, over time, the most important story, because the question of whether or not they're going to be from Britain, it's difficult, it's challenging, it's bloody, but it also is settled definitively. Whereas the question of exactly what these words mean and who has access to them and how they're going to be used and how they're going to be repurposed, that doesn't end in 1783 or 1883 or 2023. It just doesn't end.
Well, thank you so much. I don't think I have any more questions. I
Great.
feel like
All right. Well, I won't be there to see this, so I'll never know. I mean, I'll never be able to watch the people kind of trickling back to the bar or walking out early. But I hope there's still a few of you left. And thanks for listening. And goodbye.